thanks very much. This is really an excellent book, and I'm delighted to be here. When English-speaking scholars have asked me in the past to recommend works on the German resistance, Professor Heinemann's contribution, not this one, but his contribution to Germany in the Second World War, Volume 9, has always been at the top of my list. And this book will, frankly, replace it. As a military history of what was, in the end, a military operation, written by a distinguished professor, a student of the great Mommsen, who was hardly an uncritical observer of the National Conservative Resistance, and a veteran of 4 decades service to the German army, this is really without parallel in English and German. So let me begin by saying, well done, Professor Heinemann. But of course, I have a couple of questions. But before I put them, I'll actually begin with something I read, a critique outlined by Jean-Luc Lelot in Francia Recensio, a publication of the German Historical Institute in Paris. And to Professor Heinemann's credit, he actually sent that to me. And he says this, and I'm translating from the French here: "My main criticism of this book concerns its construction. The author's use of previously published articles creates the impression of a collage, resulting in repetitions and redundancies, a weakness accentuated by an overly thematic treatment of the subject. The prose lacks felicity. Such an edifice ill serves this otherwise erudite study." Now, this is not a criticism I share, but perhaps you would like to respond to that, Professor Heinemann.
Thank you also for inviting me back to my old place, the Center of Military History. Randall, that's a fair question. I thought it was a fair review, and Jean-Luc Leleu was certainly fair in asking that question. There is an element of truth in that, but then in some way there is not as well. The point is that I've been working on this topic of the resistance against Hitler practically ever since my student days, and as you say, since my student days with Hans Mommsen. And this book has been at the back of my mind for many years. And for many years, I accepted speaking engagements, conference participations, etc., on the topic of the resistance only if I could go and kind of test ideas, things that I wanted to put in the book, and I wanted to put them to a critical audience and get their response, and then maybe sharpen my argument a bit or modify it. And that is why many of the things in the book have been published in some way or another, somewhere, sometimes what we would call loco obscuro, so somewhere where nobody finds it anyway. But I think the combination as a whole is novel. And also, yes, some things get mentioned twice or 3 times because it is a systematic approach. It is not a narrative that starts in the beginning and ends and in the end. It is systematic, and that always means that some things need to be mentioned in various contexts, and that's what I've done. It was my decision to do it that way, and I knew that it would result in that, and I think it is still the better way of treating it, because we have a lot of chronological narratives out there, but this kind of systematic approach is new.
Perfect. Thanks very much. As I say, this wasn't a criticism I share, but it's out there. Let's move on to something else, and this is the tension within the moral aims of the resistors. So on the one hand, we have this revulsion against the atrocities against Jews, against civilians in general. And on the other hand, there's a desire to save a German army, which Hitler was leading not only to defeat, but to complete obliteration. And at the end of the book, you say, all of this cannot detract from our findings that those officers who risked and often lost their lives did what was morally right. Military motives, saving the German army, do not per se preclude a moral quality. Now, this raises the question, and I'm certainly not the first to ask it, but it bears repetition. What would have happened had the Wehrmacht been winning or won? Would the Holocaust, the mass starvation and enslavement of the Slavs, and the many other murders have compelled the military to act had it enjoyed success on the battlefield?
My book is not a moral book. I wouldn't say historians are immoral, but if you do military history, you talk about millions of dead people, and you still need to keep a systematic approach. So my question is not so much were they morally right. This is my final observation, but as a whole, I try to explain, not judge. The way you ask the question is a way that would not have concerned people at the time, because it was clear to them that Hitler was leading Germany, not only the Wehrmacht, but Germany as a whole, to destruction, and meant to do so. He had stated clearly and several times that he was going to pull Germany down with him if he was going to go down. Now, with all those crimes, they have a moral side. They also had a political side, and the conspirators knew that. The conspirators knew that with a Germany that had committed these crimes, and of course, particularly with Hitler, who had been the instigator of these crimes, nobody would ever conclude a peace. The question was not so much what would the peace be, where would the German frontier in the east be, or whatever. The first point was that with Hitler at the helm, there would never be a peace. Hitler, who would not want peace, for Hitler, war was the regular state of affairs anyway, and the Allies would not conclude a peace with him because nobody was going to touch him after all the things he had done. So it was not a question of the Wehrmacht winning. It was a question of this war was designed by Germany and the German leadership in such a way that it could not have a positive end for Germany. And that's what they revolted against.
I agree. But I think there's, let me come back to the issue though. I mean, Peter Hoffmann goes to great length in his magnus opus, in his biography of Stauffenberg, to make the claim that Tresco and Stauffenberg were motivated in their resistance fundamentally by the atrocities on the Eastern Front. What you seem to be saying is that's not the case, that in the absence of the fundamental military component, that is, no hope for a peace, the inevitability of defeat and destruction of Germany, there would have been no resistance. So it is conceivable that the resistors would have went along had it been possible for Germany to win the war, despite the atrocities.
I'm always reluctant to go into counterfactual history. You have Tresco, who's been hatching plots against Hitler ever since 1938. Ever since Hitler tried to get Germany into a war in 1938. But then, of course, him and Beck and the others were not against a war as such, and they were certainly not against a war with Czechoslovakia. They were against a war with Czechoslovakia at that time because they felt it was a war that Germany could not win, and it would mean finis Germaniae, the end of Germany. And that's what they objected to. They objected to the murder of 6 million Jews and so many million Soviet citizens, prisoners of war and others, but largely because they felt it was a crime against the German nation, because it saddled the German nation with the history of a huge crime that it would never be able to live down, and that Germany, after committing all those crimes, would never be able to raise its head again within the family of civilized nations. So for them, it was above all, they were national conservatives. They wanted to conserve their nation, and that was their prime concern. And they knew that with all these crimes, Germany was doomed to a very bitter end of the war.
So it sounds like von Klemperer rather than Hoffmann. Let's move on to something which is roughly in the same space, though a slightly different angle. And this is the role of Otto Neber, with whom it seems Tresco cooperated more than did Stauffenberg, assigning Neighbor to Einsatzgruppe B. And given that, and this, at the risk of sounding a little bit like Gerlach here, doesn't this implicate Tresco more directly in the atrocities than one might have allowed before? I would refer to page 87 of your book. And on page 179, you say, and I quote, "Recent research has reached a consensus that the men around Tresco knew about the mass murders and did nothing to stop them. These disturbing findings require further examination." I'd like you to say a bit more here, because that sounds like a little bit of a dodge. And it seems to me on page 183 that you address the issue more directly, saying, in effect, Tresco, or in fact, Tresco turned a blind eye to the I'm not quoting you, but the idea is that Tresco turned a blind eye to the massacres until he realized A, their extent, the Borisov massacre of 15,000 Jews being very important, and until he realized the fact that people were not being killed in order to win a war, but rather a war was being waged in order to kill people. And that key fact was a stain on German honor. Have I missed something here? And if not, I don't understand the hesitance of the first thing I quoted.
You have two poles here. You have Tresco, who is, as I say, a conspirator since 1938, who is maybe the most determined, the most clear-cut anti-Hitler conspirator of them all. And you have Arthur Neighbor, one of those who were really in the crimes up to their neck, and still got hanged for participation in the 20th July plot. So not everybody involved in the 20th July plot was a nice guy. There's a number of people who were involved, some more, some less. And actually, I couldn't think of anyone who was not involved in the crimes in any way. There is nobody without blame. And one of them, Steve, says it. He writes to his wife and says, "None of us can claim not to have been touched by all these crimes. And what is going to happen to Germany will be the just retribution for the things we have done, or at least we have failed to stop." So they're all involved, but Neighbor is certainly, out of all those that get killed in the conspiracy, Neighbor is certainly the worst implicated. Let's say if the Nazis hadn't hanged him in January 1945, the Brits would have hanged him after the Einsatzgruppenprozess, and justly so. So, okay, Neighbor is. So it does need to be explained. How can those two, this arch conspirator, this arch anti-Nazi, and the arch war criminal, how can they cooperate? Now, my explanation why the conspirators take their time acting against all those murders is that initially they believe that this is a war waged to liberate Russia from Bolshevism. And they also obviously believe initially that many of the Bolshevik functionaries are Jews. You have one of the few survivors, Gersdorf, who says that as a witness in a court case in Munich in 1959. In 1959, 15 years after the event, and still states that, he still believes that. And then they realize it's not that we are shooting Jewish Komsomol functionaries, partisan chiefs, or whatever to pacify the rear areas. We are not shooting people in order to win a war the way we have been thinking a war works. Shooting people is the war aim. And we're coming back to the first question. They realize that Hitler's war aim is not the kind of war aim they have in mind, Clausewitz trained as they are. They see Hitler's war aims are unlimited. That's why there is never going to be an end to the war. And they are about the ethnical cleansing of all of Eastern Europe, and practically of all of Europe. And that's not the war they want to fight. That's where they start saying, this can't be it. And that's what drives them into the resistance.
Thank you very much. Let's move from Berlin to Paris and the coup in Paris. And when I was doing research for Disobeying Hitler, I came across a wonderful ultra intercept I didn't see the original German by General Wagner in Sossen. Shortly he killed himself 3 days later. He had learned that the coup had failed in Berlin, and he sends out a telegram, or he sends out a message saying, hopefully Paris sees it through. And as you note, on page 326, Paris did see it through. Nowhere, I quote, did the uprising of the 20th of July succeed as well as it did in Paris. The Gestapo, the SS, completely locked down and arrested Paris entirely in the hands of the resistance. And my question to you is this, the first one: why did they go ahead even though they knew Berlin had failed? Stauffenberg had believed that the plot would only succeed if Hitler had been killed. Did Hofacker take a different view?
Well, Hofacker learned about the fact that Hitler had survived too late to stop the preparations. In Paris, they had done what they had not been able to do in and around Berlin, namely start preparations for a coup d'etat earlier on during the day. So by the time the news filtered through that, Hitler had survived, it was too late to stop things anyway. So they went ahead, hoping that Kluge, Field Marshal Kluge, Commander-in-Chief, both of the entire Western Front and by now also of Army Group Bravo, because Rommel had been incapacitated, that Kluge would actually take the opportunity. Now, Kluge had been Tresco's and Gersdorf's and so on, Commander-in-Chief on the Eastern Front, and he knew about the conspiracy. They had a reason to believe Kluge was in their favor. Kluge, however, lost his nerve, declined to do anything, and probably hoped to save his skin. And like 2 weeks later, he was summarily sacked by Hitler and shot himself on the way back to Berlin. So whatever Kluge did, he poisoned himself. Whatever Kluge did, it didn't save his neck. But at the time, I think he once said to Gersdorf, according to Gersdorf anyway, Gersdorf, that's the point, Field Marshal Kluge is not a great man. He did not live up to the situation. The situation would have enabled him to end the war in the West, to open the Western Front. Preparations had been made. And if he had wanted to, he could have gone ahead. Nobody would have been there to stop him. Whether the entire army would have followed him in view of Hitler's survival is another question. He never tried it. That's tragic. He is another one of those who perished in the resistance and who never got a monument built in their honor, and that is just as well. Yeah, they're not only nice guys, they're not only heroes in that story, and not only nice guys, there are some pretty nasty guys and some people who were less than heroic.
I mean, there's two steps there, though. So Hofacker and Stumpnagel learned too late of the failure of Hitler's survival and the failure in Berlin. Everyone had been arrested, but of course they simply could have released them all. Sorry, chaps, that was just a military drill. And since the SS and the Gestapo, the SS in Paris was rather embarrassed by the fact that they'd been made to look like complete asses, being arrested by Bonneberg's division while they were in their barracks, they were very happy to keep quiet about it after it occurred. So that was one possibility. Just let them go. They made the day trip to see Kluge, hoping that this would lead to an end of the war. Two questions there. You don't like counterfactual history, but July 20th is all about counterfactual, so I'm not going to let you off the hook on that one. How much of a difference do you think it would have made had Kluge surrendered in the West, stopped fighting? And since he refused, why didn't they just shoot him and do it themselves?
Why didn't they shoot Kluge and do it themselves? You need someone who can actually issue orders to the troops in the field. And if the commander-in-chief is not there, maybe his deputy would. That's what we have in the replacement army. Fromm gets arrested. His deputy is Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg sends out orders right, left, and center. So that works. And Kluge, obviously the man to replace him would have been Rommel. Rommel was in hospital, unconscious. So that was not an option either. And Kluge's chief of staff in Paris was rather anti-Nazi. Kluge's chief of staff as a commander-in-chief Army Group B was Hans Speidel, later a four-star general in the Bundeswehr, who is more of a desktop general and not really a man, even though he has a PhD in history, but he is still not a man to take quick decisions. So no, that was an option none of them really saw. The point is, eventually, if you want to get the army to march against Hitler, that's tricky enough as it is. If you want to get the army to march against Hitler at the orders of a two-star general, who is a desktop general and nobody knows his face, won't work. It's not a realistic option.
They didn't have to, well, march against Hitler in a metaphorical sense, but all they had to do was lay down their arms. So again, let's come back to Kluge. What sort of difference do you think that would have made had he been a great man?
Had he been a great man, he would have authorized his staff to shoot Hitler dead when he visited Kluge's headquarters on the Eastern Front in 1943, and we wouldn't have seen. So here we go again into why I don't do counterfactual history. The idea was to open up the Western Front. For that, you wouldn't need to tell the troops to lay down arms. You could give a couple of well-designed orders so as to open up a gap somewhere where the Allies could then push in, and then, in view of that disaster, and fighting. That would have been one option. There had been contacts with the French resistance. We don't know much about those, so we don't know what arrangements have been made. If you wanted to get the German army to march back in good order to the Reich frontier, you needed the support of the resistance for them to stop blowing up railway lines, and you needed an accord with the Allies to stop bombing anything that moved on the road. And those things could have been done as well, but the obvious option would have been to create an operational disaster which would allow the Allies to just break through, and that would be the end of it. That's something you could have done without most soldiers realizing what was happening.
So to pursue that further, but with Kluge not cooperating, such a move was impossible.
Who could have authorized such a move? As I say, nobody really, certainly not against Kluge.
Fair enough. You mentioned the Allies there, and you make the point that the resistance, particularly early on, the German resistance made its action, its activity highly contingent on support from Britain, above all, but also France. Page 136. All plans relied on cooperation with the British, and to a lesser degree, the French. And this, in a sense, makes sense, given their correct assumption that the army, 1938-1939, did not want a war with the great powers. Well, that makes sense. What I don't understand is why they made their action dependent on a positive signal, why they boxed themselves into a corner where we won't act until the Allies do first. And then the Allies, of course, said, how can we believe that any of these bits of information that are drifting back to Paris and London are reliable and not sort of a ruse? Why didn't they simply act in the knowledge that Britain and France would be there?
Let's just suppose I'm a conspirator and you're not, and we are both Wehrmacht officers. We meet somewhere in the mess over a glass of cognac or whatever, and I try to recruit you. And I tell you, look, you not think something needs to be done, and you seem amenable. So one thing leads to the other, and I say, look, we have a conspiracy going on. We want to topple the Führer. Are you willing to join? You would probably ask, okay, but what do you have to offer to the German nation? With Hitler, we're heading for unconditional surrender. The Allies have stated that quite clearly. Do you have anything better than that to offer? And my answer would have to be, sorry, no. And that was the problem the conspiracy was facing, that in view of the demand for unconditional surrender, they tried to preserve the nation, but didn't really have much of an alternative to offer to what the Allies had ordained for the Reich anyway. So that is why the conspiracy, especially the political side, the diplomatic side, Ulrich von Hassen and Adam von Trott, the two diplomatic experts in the conspiracy, why they always and again tried to get the Allies to make them some sort of offer, especially the British. For the British, the situation was, of course, what if all this is not a conspiracy, as they claim, but is a plot by the Nazis to get us to make promises, and then they make it public and play us off against Stalin. Stalin had done a 180-degree turn in 1939, and who knew from the London point of view if Stalin would not do the same thing again in 1943? So for the British, it was totally inadmissible to make any kind of binding concession, far too risky for the alliance warfare. For the resistance, without any such concession, it was very, very difficult to explain to the German nation why the new government would be better for Germany than the old one.
Yeah, I was actually even thinking back even earlier into the late 1930s, but all fair points. I mean, the difficulty with that argument, though, is that all the actual attempts, that the major attempts that occurred after unconditional surrender was agreed, not before. So it clearly wasn't a block.
It was a block of sorts. The answer was, this war is lost. We will have to surrender, but it makes a difference whether we surrender, whether we end this war now, with the Allies and the Soviets still far outside the country, and without making all the sacrifices in bombed cities, in people killed, that we are bound to make if we carry on fighting this war. Don't forget that half the German losses occurred between 20 July 1944 and the end of the war. So like 1/2 of German losses could have been avoided if on that day the war would have been over, even if it also ended with unconditional surrender. And that's a moral choice, because the downside to that is, if that had worked, of course, the Nazis would have claimed that stab in the back again, we would have won this war if those guys hadn't stabbed us in the back. Actually, that's what the Nazis tried for the rest of the war until 1945 and beyond. So, which you found more important, to save Germany from utter destruction or to prevent another stab in the back legend? That was anybody's choice.
Thank you very much, Professor Heinemann, for discussing an excellent book. Thank you to the organizers for having me, and thanks to everyone for listening.